Danielle Carlock, and we've got our stuff. Great. Danielle is a reference and instruction librarian at Scottsdale Community College, Maricopa Native Seed Library, and Maricopa Pollinator Pathway. Danielle is the founder of the Maricopa Native Seed Library and the Maricopa Pollinator Pathway. She has been a librarian for 19 years, and prior to that, she was a biology teacher. Danielle has been avidly gardening with Sonoran Desert plants for about 13 years. So as a reminder, please make sure you're muted, and if you have any questions during the talk, just pop them in the chat. Danielle, it's your turn.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Wonderful. So I'll be going through the slides and chatting, and I'll ask Anita to move to the next slide when we get there because I'm not controlling the screen right now. So here's just some different photos of activities related to the seed library, and I'll be talking about a lot of those activities as we go along. And next slide, please. There was already introduction, so I'll skip over this and just mention again that I am a librarian. So I come with that background, but I also have a background in biology as well. But my greatest teacher was my own garden, a garden that I built back in 2011, and I added about 150 native plant species to that garden. And I really saw how you can change so many things by adding native plants. I saw the beauty, I saw the wildlife, and that was very inspirational for me to get involved with the native seed library as first as a sabbatical project, and now it's 5 years in. Next slide, please. So I'm really going to be talking about two different things here related to native seed libraries. I'm going to go over the why to give some background, at least what drives me to have a native seed library, why I think they're important, what the underpinnings are, some of the logistics and mechanics. But if you already have a seed library that's focused maybe on food plants or traditional crops, and you want to incorporate more native plants into it, this is also about that. So I really just want to see native seed and native plants everywhere. So that's really what this is about. And there'll be pictures of various native plants of the Sonoran Desert throughout that are seed library plants. And this is one of the amazing vines that we have in the Sonoran Desert that's native here to Phoenix, Arizona. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the why. And so in order to talk about the why and what drives me, and I hope will drive other people involved in this work, is that I believe native seed libraries are an avenue for promoting what's known as urban restoration and habitat at home. Next slide, please. So let's talk about ecological restoration and urban restoration, which are typically I think kind of separated as maybe in terms of disciplines or approaches, but I think they're very complementary and they're both very needed right now. We know our wildlands are very fragmented and they're under tremendous threats. And we see it in the news every day right now. Fire, human development, drought, invasive species, and then we have climate change that's multiplying uh, and magnifying all of those threats. So we have ecological restoration, which is a field that's the intent of that field is to help repair, or restore habitats or ecosystems that have been damaged, whether it's from mining or fire or different types of things that have happened to those systems. And that's sort of ecological restoration that occurs, in wildlands, natural areas, forest, rivers, places like that. But you also have this other concept or process, urban restoration, which is attempting to bring back, let's say, nature or a close approximation of it to the places we live. So, in other words, urban areas, cities, towns, villages, and how can we bring natural elements back into that environment? How can we increase biodiversity, and how can we also bring back the natural functions of ecosystems, even in these places we live? How can we purify the air, increase recreation activities, cool down the environment, and capture carbon and many other things. And this is all the aims of urban restoration. And I really think right now we need both more than ever before. We're going to need both these urban and ecological restoration, and they're really complementary. And so the Native Seed Library for me was founded on this idea of helping to engage in urban restoration, giving people some of those, at least some of those tools through native plants. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about habitat at home as a kind of a type or a form, a way of engaging in urban restoration. So Habitat Home is really, when you see Audubon Society and other organizations promoting it, which is great, and it's really about, let's think about with gardening, not just something maybe for human, food needs and or aesthetics, what we think looks nice, what's pretty to us, but to actually garden for wildlife um, and and nature. So it's really about gardening intentionally and specifically with native plants and other wildlife friendly practices. And by doing this, you can support all the different, aspects of urban restoration, purifying air, increasing biodiversity. Native plants can support all of those things. And Doug Tallamy is one of the people that's really influenced me. I think Lisa and Anita in the chat, I have, or excuse me, if there's a link to Doug Tallamy's website, if you could put that in the chat. He's a writer, he's a biologist who's written a lot and really influenced me. And one of the things he said on one of the talks I was at, what you grow influences what you can live around you, what you choose to put into whatever landscapes, whether it's a home, a front yard, or potted plants on a balcony, what you choose to put there influences what can grow around you. And that's sort of the point of the picture on the slide is I have a prickly pear that I grow and it supports native bees. And so if I hadn't chose to put that particular plant in my yard, as well as others and engage in other practices for native bees, they won't be able to live there. So the idea here is really changing how people think about gardening and make a more expansive view. And that contributes to urban restoration. Next slide, please. So now I want to get into native plants because that's really what a native seed library is all about. And it's really the underpinning, it's foundational for urban restoration habitat at home is to utilize native plants. And I am a big enthusiast of native plants. They're one of the most my favorite things. And I'm always working toward, promoting them. And so I just want to give a definition and talk a little bit about them. So a little bit of a biology lesson here. And, this may be really elementary, but just so we're all kind of on the same page about it, is in my definition, a native plant, a plant that has evolved locally over a long period of time and is an intrinsic part of a local ecosystem. So every area, every ecosystem, whether you're talking about a specific mountain range, it has plants that are native to it, or you're talking about a continent, it has plants native to it. Every area has its own assemblage of native plants, and that area can be small or big. So we all have our own assemblages of native plants where we live. And so native plants are part of that local food web. They are connected to the microorganisms. They're connected to the insects, the birds, all the other living things that they engage. They're in a food web together. And these native plants are adapted to the local conditions, the soils, the climate, what kind of sun and let's say precipitation regimes are in that location. They are adapted to those places. And most importantly, native plants have relationships with other native organisms that have evolved over long periods of time. And this is just some pictures of some of the native plants of the Sonoran Desert that are seed library plants that I offer. Um, so native plants are really, each area has its own assemblage of native plants. Next slide, please. So there are probably almost an infinite number of interactions between native plants and the other organisms in that ecosystem. So I just pull one out to highlight it because this is really important to like really everything I'm doing, trying to do with the seed library is to have people grow native plants so that they're able to interact with and support wildlife. And so this is just kind of a really well-known example is milkweeds and monarchs. So looking at the life cycle of the monarch butterfly, adults lay eggs. They lay eggs only on milkweeds. And most butterflies and moths, they lay their eggs on what's called a larval host plant. And that is either one species or a group of species that they have co-evolved with and that they will lay their eggs on. So a butterfly or moth doesn't typically lay its eggs just on any old plant. It requires a plant that it has developed this sort of relationship with. So we have the egg that's then laid on the milkweed plant. The caterpillar or larva goes through multiple stages of growth, eating parts of the plant until it's ready to go metamorphose into a butterfly. And so all that stage is all occurring on the milkweed, and it can't occur without milkweed. And so the butterfly cannot reproduce, can't complete its life cycle without milkweed. And so that is why, and this is just like I said, one example of many, many, many examples of interactions between native plants and native insects or wildlife. And so this is why native plants are so important because non-native plants, which we'll talk about next, they won't necessarily have these relationships because they haven't evolved over long periods of time with those organisms. Next slide, please. So now we have to talk about, since I brought up the concept of a native plant, what is an introduced or invasive? And I'm glad that came up in Anita's presentation too. We've already been talking about these a bit. This is great. So an introduced plant is a plant that was brought, it's native to somewhere else and was introduced into a local ecosystem that it doesn't have relationships with the organisms there. It didn't evolve there. Like, so for example, bougainvillea and oleander are widely used in Arizona and southern, in the deserts of Arizona, but they were introduced from other areas. So those plants are native to other places and introduced here. Generally, they're considered maybe neutral, not necessarily harmful, but when they become or when they are harmful, then they're considered invasive. So invasive is a type of introduced species and it exhibits aggressive growth and crowding out of native plants. And so we're having a lot of issues with invasive species here in central and southern Arizona, as are many other areas. And I just highlight a couple here. So again, these are just types of plants that, and we talked about that too, also in the previous presentation. I don't offer invasive species. I do have some plants that I guess I consider bioregionally native that I'll talk about when we get deeper into it that I offer in the seed library. But in general, I'm sticking to plants that are Maricopa County natives. Those are plants that are native to my county, with a few exceptions that I'll talk about later. So next slide, please. So now, because I've brought up native plants and introduced species and invasive species, I also do need to touch on cultivars. And so, humans have a long history, right? Thousands and thousands of years of cultivating plants, selecting plants to breed or to reproduce because they have a certain trait that's desirable for humans. Like, and this has been very advantageous to humans for our food crops, right? We've really improved so many different traits with our food crops by doing this. But I believe the problem comes in is when we start doing this with native plants, when we take wild native plants and we start selecting for traits that humans want, aren't necessarily important to pollinators or wildlife. The pollinators and wildlife, they could lose traits that they need for their survival. Because remember the interactions between native plants and native organisms, they can lose that. So, and the problem with this is when it comes to native plants is a lot of times at nurseries, they sell these cultivars, or sometimes they're called nativars. And the kind of the tell will be that right here in the slide where you see Echinacea purpurea, and then it says in parentheses green jewel or pink double delight. When you see in parentheses sort of an English name, and it's usually kind of whimsical, that is kind of the tell that it's a cultivar that's been altered for some trait, typically a trait that humans want and not necessarily helpful to pollinators and actually can be harmful. So let me go through the pictures of the coneflower here. On the top left is the unaltered wild purple coneflower, top left. Top right is one that's been selected to be green in color, and that may be difficult for pollinators to recognize because they're not used to. They didn't evolve with the green coneflower. They may not recognize it or know how to use it or utilize it. And then the bottom right is one that's been selected for to be more robust in growth form. I don't remember the name of that cultivar, and that may be more. That could be beneficial, maybe, but we don't know. It could be more neutral. Um, and then so going back to the one of the green one may be harmful to pollinators. And now going to the bottom left, that one is definitely harmful for pollinators. It's a double flowered cultivar. It's been produced because people like the way these look, double flowered cultivar, but they're very concerning for wildlife because they don't produce pollen, which native bees need for provisioning their nests, and then the nectar is inaccessible. So what can happen here is that bees and other pollinators could spend their efforts trying to access these the nectar and pollen and be unsuccessful. And this is very not good for them to be spending their time trying to access things that aren't going to meet their needs. So when it comes to cultivars for native plants, I would probably try to really encourage people to stay away from offering any cultivars of native plants in a seed library. I mean, because we can't always know they could be beneficial perhaps in some cases. But they're most likely going to be neutral or harmful to wildlife, and you can't always know that. So it's always best to stay with the wild as much as possible when we're talking about native plants if we're trying to support pollinators or other wildlife. This is a bit of a controversial topic, but and I think that I do have a link to more information about the idea of cultivars or nativars. If you're able to put that in the chat, I think I do have something there. Next slide, please. So I also just want to touch on native seed availability. There's a free report from the National Academies about this topic, and so they have really underlined and underscored the fact that our native seed supply is not adequate to support our current and future ecological restoration projects. So there's a lot of efforts toward trying to figure out how we can really get bulk this up. It's also really difficult to source native plants for residential use in our region. And a big shout out to Desert Survivors. I think they're on the call today. A lot of people in Phoenix do drive down to Tucson to Desert Survivors to get some of the native plants that are native to Maricopa County and Pima County, but we can't obtain a lot of these plants. And that was one of the other reasons I started the seed library to try to make some of these more available. And so, again, native seed libraries can help raise awareness of the importance of native plants and hopefully increase demand. So the more you have consumers asking for native plants, the more I think that's going to help to drive that chain. And then native seed libraries can help increase the seed availability for residential uses and really make a dent and help with urban restoration because people can't, if they can't have access, if they don't have access to native plants, they cannot engage in a lot of these urban restoration activities. You don't want to do that with introduced plants or cultivars. Next slide, please. I think there was a link to that. That's a free online book that I just had in the last slide. You can Google it, or I think I have the link. So I think this is one of my final slides on this aspect of the presentation. I just wanted to hit on again, just to summarize, these are some of the arguments I make when I'm trying to convince people to use native plants, because not a lot of people understand their importance. And I get things like, well, it grows here. What's the big deal? When they're talking about like introduced things, what's the big deal? It grows here, it's like, well, but it's not really supporting wildlife. So I just want to hit on, and I think we really hit on the ecological in the previous slides, but a couple of other important, you know, arguments that can be made. We can make arguments about economics. Native seeds are adapted to the region that they're from. They evolved in that region. So they're going to require less inputs of like fertilizer or pesticide or water because they're adapted to the conditions locally. So that's going to be a money savings, from the economic perspective, right? And there's other economic perspectives too. There's lots of valuations of all the ecosystem services that native plants offer, and the valuations, it's astronomical, right? We really can't live without these plants. Um, and then if we talk about health on the individual level, if someone engages in habitat at home and they start to see and engage in nature more and appreciating nature more, there's studies that show that reduces blood pressure, increases mood. So there's just on an individual level, not to mention the community level, as you start engaging in urban restoration and more people do this and do habitat at home, we can reap some of the benefits of the cooling and the air purifying and things like that and start changing the paradigm of how we live with nature. So these are just some of those arguments. Next slide, please. So now we're going into part two, how to start a native seed library. And I didn't get to mention in the beginning too, is I think you have my email address. I think it was put in the chat. Feel free to reach out at any time, if you have questions about things about native seed library. I'm constantly trying to improve what I have going, and I'm happy to share and brainstorm with you as you're trying to do this. So next slide, please. So native seed libraries can exist in a range of venues, and I've experimented with a lot of different places, and there's many things on my list I still want to try. I haven't tried yet as far as where to actually put the seed to reach as many people as possible. And that's been my goal always has been how can I reach as many people? And so I followed a distributed model where I have seeds at multiple of our community college campuses and other places. And so be creative. Where can you reach the most people? How can you reach people really efficiently and reach them with native seeds? So as a librarian, though, I do have to just say I really support the idea of traditional brick and mortar libraries being a part of this. They don't have to be, but they're a great avenue because they are accessible to the public. There's no cost barrier. And all of the values that librarians have been supporting since the start of the profession really align with so many of these things. So I reach out, or I recommend that you reach out to your local libraries if you're thinking of starting a native seed library. Like perhaps they already have a food plant library, which is common. A lot of seed library or a lot of libraries have food plant libraries. Maybe you can offer a couple of native seed species that they can integrate into what they already have because they may not have access to that. So next slide, please. Just something to think about with that. So I'm going to talk about the seed library I started. I started it in 2020 and I envisioned it as more than just seed distribution because to me the education piece was almost, I don't want to say more important, but they're so it's equally important because if people don't understand why native plants are important, it's really hard to get people motivated about it. So the mission is up there, and you can see it has the mission of education and distribution. And the components are, how do I get the seed? How do I distribute it? Outreach and education, seed gardens, demonstration gardens, which I'll talk about more. Germination trials. In the beginning, I did my own germination trials to try to figure out, well, how do I get these native species to germinate? Prior to that, I was mostly a gardener who would purchase plants and put them in the ground. But I began doing my own germination trials, trying to keep track of, because I want to be able to tell people, well, how do you get these to germinate? I can always say the blanket statement, just sow them and nature will take care of it. But I wanted to be able to offer, some more tips than that and make it easy for people to overcome some of those challenges. And now we have a nature center at Scottsdale Community College that's doing a lot of that now as well, which has been amazing. And I want to talk a little bit about assessment too, because I think that's a piece that you don't hear as much about is how do you figure out if any of this is working? And then I also started a pollinator habitat certification program. So I'll talk about all these different pieces and parts. Next slide, please. And I think if it hasn't been in the chat yet, if there's a chance to put the Seed Library's website, or you can Google Maricopa Native Seed Library and the site will come up. So when I started this in fall 2020, which was right during the height of the pandemic, I really didn't know what was going to happen. It was a sabbatical project, but I wanted it to be a long-term thing. And I thought, well, okay, I'm just going to open this thing and I hope some people will come. And actually, I couldn't really open it truly because I had to operate under pandemic conditions. So it was a little weird in the beginning. But there was a lot of interest. And very quickly, I got media attention in the first year, I got some recognition. And now, in the intervening time, we've given out 31,000 seed package, which really blows my mind because I don't know where all this, how this all happened. Really, it's kind of sometimes it just seems a bit miraculous. I really have been thankful that there's been this much interest in it. And I know not necessarily everyone understands what they're taking. Some people come to the seed library, and I've observed from a distance some people taking things just because they're there to take. Hopefully, they're not selling them, like Anita mentioned. That's disturbing that hopefully things like that aren't happening, but they could be. But I also get a lot of feedback from people about it's changed their lives to have had access to these seeds and what's happened in their gardens. So it's really cool. And I say there is definitely an unmet need for native seeds, and I bet there's an unmet need for those in your area too. Or you can certainly drive it through education efforts. Next slide, please. So we have different types of plants in the seed library. There's over 50 species offered. Everything from big stuff like trees to smaller ground covers and grasses. My focus has been when I was trying to figure out what plants to bring into the seed library, do they have a high wildlife value? So mainly that I focus a lot on nectar and larval host plants. I focused on the most xeric plants because of the drought conditions here and also what was not commercially available because I thought if these plants are already commercially available, maybe they're not as important to offer as seed because people can go buy the plants in nurseries and easy to germinate. But that doesn't mean every plant in the seed library meets all those characteristics, but that was kind of a filter. If it met all four of those, oh, gotta have it in the seed library. And if it met maybe one, it really depended, but I made decisions. And locally native to Maricopa County, bioregionally native. I do have some things that are a little bit outside of our region, but they're not invasive and they're beneficial to wildlife. Next slide, please. The components, I'm going to go through each of these. I'm kind of moving a little more quickly because I think I'm a little bit behind the curve in my time. So next slide, please, and we'll go into procurement. This is a big piece, right? Because you have to figure out, where am I going to get these plants? And the next slide is going to show a chart. I think it's the chart. And there's a lot of content in this chart. Next slide, please. Where I'm going to compare and contrast different methods for obtaining native seeds. Generally, well, we'll say wild or not, we'll say not cultivars. So wild collecting, I do a lot of this. Wild collecting is something that you need to do, obtaining permits. I have a permit from the Tonto National Forest, and I have also a permit from one of our local cities to collect. And so what the benefits of wild collecting is you're capturing the genetic diversity of the seed. I try really hard to make sure that when I'm collecting, I'm engaging in ethical seed harvesting from the Seeds of Success from the Bureau of Land Management. I'm utilizing that and I'm taking an effort to make sure I'm collecting a small amount of seed from every one of the individual plants I encounter to capture whatever genetic diversity might be there so that genetic diversity is then carried into the urban restoration that will then occur, afterward. And sometimes you have to wild collect because it may be your only source of certain species because they're not available through other means. But it is labor intensive. You do require permits. You have to know your plants. You have to be able to identify your plants. You have to do it ethically. And you have no control over factors like drought or predation. I've dealt with both of those and that have hampered my efforts very much so. It is difficult if you have mobility limitations. As I'm aging, it's a little harder to be off trail, collecting seeds. And of course, there's more time and carbon footprint. But wild collecting would probably be a part of most native seed libraries, simply for the fact that a lot of these seeds aren't necessarily available in other places. But seed gardens are another possibility, and I've been doing more and more of this. I've established a seed garden at my campus. There's one at a couple other campuses. And so we're able to start native plants, get them into the gardens. They become a place where people can come and look at the plants and see what they look like. And then we can actually collect from those. We have more control over the conditions. I think these are going to be more and more important as the drought, continues, especially here in Arizona, to be able to collect from these places. It's easier for people to reach when you're collecting with groups. And you may actually get a benefit is if you're if these plants are they're grown in urban settings, they may adapt to the local environments better than, let's say, even the wild collected, perhaps. So there's something like that that can be said about that, and you can often get grants for starting seed gardens. These are also really labor intensive as well in a different way. Gardening is very labor intensive. You need space, you need water, and you may not get as much genetic diversity as while collecting, but you may get those very locally adapted variants. Now, purchasing or donation, I do all three of these for the seed library, and some of these are it depends on the situation. Like there's certain plants that I have to wild collect for because I haven't gotten them into the seed gardens yet. Even when I have them in the seed gardens, I also want to wild collect because I also want to get that genetic diversity piece. I do take a very small amount of donations. I don't do any purchases. Some people may need to consider that, but I don't do any purchases. But I take some donations from trusted gardeners that I know what I'm getting. And that's a small percentage, very small percentage. But there's some cons there. And I'm sorry, I'm moving a little quicker because I think I'm running out of time. What's my time like right now? Right now, Anita?
You've got like 12 minutes.
How many?
12 minutes.
Oh, that's more than I thought. Is that for including questions or?
Not including questions until the next presentation.
Okay, okay. So we'll go more quickly, but if there's more questions about this, we can come back to it, or you can follow up with me individually. Next slide, please. So you have to make those decisions about what's going to be, how are you going to obtain the seeds? And maybe a mixture will work for you too, or it may really depend on your situation. But if you're a librarian like me, and maybe you don't have a lot of background in, some of you are coming more from a natural sciences background, some of you are coming more from a librarian background. But if you don't have that background, you may want to find your peeps, find your people. And I have a bunch of different ideas here of different groups you could reach out to see if they might want to partner with you. So let's say you're a library and you want to bring native seeds into your existing library. Well, maybe some of these different organizations, like a botanical garden or extension office or biology department of a college or BLM or a tribal agency, might be able to help you to partner with you to obtain the seeds that can then go into your seed library. And also, if there's anyone here in the region that I'm in Maricopa County, Arizona, or nearby low desert environment, you might want to contact me about becoming a pop-up for the Maricopa Native Seed Library, or maybe I can help you to integrate some species into your seed library. So I would love to hear from people that are interested in that. But again, if you're going to do wild collecting, the links, I think there's some links for the SOS protocol and Center for Plant Conservation that talk about ethical seed harvesting. This is key, especially because we want to make sure that we're taking seed, but that the plants can continue and reproduce and be viable in their wild environment too. And that's paramount. So ethical seed collecting is huge, and doing it with a permit is huge. So you can either Google the SOS BLM protocol and the Center for Plant Conservation, or we may have those links as well. Native plant societies, I think there's a link coming up on one of the next slides where you can find a native plant society near you. Next slide, please. So thinking about your target species, like what are you going to prioritize? And I mentioned what my priorities were a couple of slides back, but maybe you want to think about, okay, I'm just going to start with a couple of species that are easy for me to obtain, or maybe they're easy to germinate. They have wildlife value to our region, or they maybe have cultural significance to our region. And I have a bunch of links, if they're able to put in the chat, to the SciNet, or you could Google these SciNet Regional Network. And then there's also plant lists from Audubon, Xerxes, and other places that give you some native plants that might be very have high wildlife value. I think those are what most of those links are. And again, tapping into your community of experts, I think is key. Next slide, please. So now that you've procured seeds, you have to think about processing and packaging. And this was something that took me a while. And also developing my target list of plants was many, many months before I began the seed library. But processing and packaging, how much processing are you actually going to do? The advice I got from someone in this field was to process it to the level that it's recognizable as seed. But I'm not a seed company. I don't have, vast amounts of labor. A lot of it is done by just a few of us. And so, luckily, a lot of these plants, when I collect them, they can go straight to being dried, and then they don't need really any processing. You take them off the plant almost as seeds. And so, and I don't do any processing of those. There's some that could require some processing, but you want to check with your local experts. Here's some examples. With New Mexico thistle, getting the seeds separated from, I guess, I don't know what the technical botanical name is, from the hairs, I'll call it, of the plant, as well as a seed cleaning machine at the Nature Center at Scottsdale Community College, someone built as a project. I think I do have a link for that machine to build that. If people are interested in that. They've been experimenting with how they can, separate some things with that. But a lot of it I do is hand processing. And so, but it's time consuming. And so I try to minimize the amount of processing I do. And actually, over the years, I've cut back on processing and just make sure that it's dry. And there might be some chaff, but it's the seed is free. And also, as Elise has taught me, a lot of plants, or seeds that they're predators like ants that will carry the seeds away, and so having them less processed can deter some of that. So you want to think about storage too. I collect seeds into brown paper bags, and then they're aired out. And then once they're processed, they go into storage in refrigerators with little desiccator packets. Even longer term storage than that would probably require freezing, but that's a more intense process because the seed has to be extremely dry in order to freeze it successfully. But generally, some of the methods you could look up: threshing and winnowing. Those are some of the methods I use, fairly simple methods. Next slide, please. So you have to think about distribution too. We talked about this a little bit before, but you can do, a permanent display like in a library. You could have a pop-up at different events. You can have the combination of these sort of things. What are your displays going to be? You might have noticed in some of my pictures, I don't have the funds for those expensive card catalogs, and we didn't keep them, unfortunately, from back in the day. So I've used some things I've gotten from thrift stores, and some inexpensive things. You have to think about packing limits and borrowing policies and inventory. Next slide, please. Education and outreach, there's a lot of things that you can do. I think this part's really important because people don't know a lot about native plants. So you can see in the bullets there all the different ways I've engaged in that, including a grow out where people signed up. They got seeds from the seed library. We tried to grow out the seeds at the same time using certain protocols and kept our data. So that was kind of a cool kind of citizen science project. But there's lots of different, ways to do this, and I encourage you to try to do this in addition to distributing the seeds. Next slide, please. You want to think about your educational materials. There's quite a few things you can put on the packets. I'll just highlight some of the main points. People always want to know which ones are easy to start from seed. When do I put them in the ground? Which can be grown in containers? I get that question all the time. And I also want to make sure that keep in mind to let people know if certain things are poisonous, so they have that they are aware of that. Next slide, please. There's lots of different ways to assess, your efforts. Keeping track of how many packets go out is a pretty straightforward way. I try to get feedback from different events. I also tried a seed survey to find out if people were getting germination, and if so, like if the plant made it to the level of, becoming like a mature plant. And that was success. That effort was moderately successful. So think about how you can assess your efforts. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, it looks like I'm getting oh good. Oh, I was getting worried about the time. So I realized I have a little more content than I had time for. But this is my last slide, and I just want to, encourage people to start slow. If you can just add a few high value natives to an existing seed library or to start with, and then just keep growing, and it will make a difference. And if you build it, they will come. And please reach out to me with any follow-up questions you have. I'm happy to brainstorm with you. Thank you.
That was awesome. Thanks, Danielle. And what I'm loving is that a lot of you are putting in questions and comments into the chat, and then other people are answering. So you all are already knowledge sharing amongst each other. I love it.
Yay,
I
thank you.
I think I did see a couple of, and as a reminder, we will be sending out the link for the recording, and in there you will be able to see. I'm not sure you can click and access the links, but you'll be able to see the links and you can put them into Google. Um, so KNEF noted that they store much of their seed in recycled plastic pill bottles, but the slide said something about using paper and not plastic. K, I think, is an area that's more humid than Arizona. They're asking if they're ruining the seed.
Well, I think that there could be more likely to, if there's any moisture, with plastic, they could rot or mold. So I try not to use, I use glass jars. Um, yeah, so basically they go from paper bags to glass jars in the refrigerator. I try not to use plastic at all.
Awesome. Brooke asked if you know of any organizations yourself, and this is also kind of a question for folks who are here. If you know of any organizations or initiatives that help First Nations communities develop their ancestral seed banks.
I think Native Seed Search in Tucson may assist with that.
Mm-hmm. And there's probably others. If other folks know of any, feel free to pop them in the chat. Let me see. Are milkweed seeds or plants the same throughout the country? Will the same milkweed seed grow in Yuma County and northern states?
No, there's different milkweeds for each of the regions that have them, and so you should always plant the regionally native milkweeds.
And it just so happens it's an excellent segue into our next talk. Our next talk is all about milkweed seed. Um, our branch was landscaped with lady slippers and milkweed grows around it. The landscapers cleared the milkweed because it was thought that they were invading the area. Does anyone have some explanation or views on this?
I know landscapers have a different paradigm. A lot of the times they think things are, weeds that we don't think are weeds and things like that, and that is a challenge.
Yeah, also sometimes people just automatically assume anything that grows fairly robustly and in high cover is aggressive and not native, even though that's not the truth.
Mhm.
Tennille asks, how do you obtain seeds from seed companies for library use?
I haven't done that because I didn't want to I wanted to have locally adapted seeds.
Mhm. Um, is there a certain way to harvest native seeds to help cultivate?
No, you just want to make sure you're taking them when they're mature. If you take them immature, you're wasting the seed, of
Yeah.
course. So you want to take them when they're mature.
Um, And I believe that's it with the questions. Wait, there's more messages. Sorry. Oy. Okay, people are talking amongst themselves. That's awesome. Um, so as I mentioned, if you have any other questions, you can pop them into the chat, or I'm going to re-put in Danielle's email into the chat so you can reach out to Danielle directly. And so, Philippa, do you want to get your talk up on the screen? Have you
Yes.
are you able to do that?
Yeah, I think so. Let me try.